So to kick things off this morning, our first speaker is no stranger to some of us who have been with Parks and Wildlife for some time. Our speaker is Bryan Richards. Bryan is the Emerging Disease Coordinator at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin. Bryan was trained in wildlife ecology at the University of Wisconsin and Southern Illinois University, and he spent over a decade involved in all facets of big game management with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Following the detection of CWD in Wisconsin, Bryan joined the National Wildlife Health Center to work with state, federal, tribal, academic, and international and non-governmental partners on CWD research, management, and outreach. So even if he's only in town here for a couple of days, would y'all help me welcome Bryan Richards back to Texas?
All right, well, good morning, everyone. And I want to start out with a sincere thank you to the hosts, thank you to the sponsors, and thank you to everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here. I very much appreciate the opportunity. Clayton, you pretty much covered most of my background. Grew up on a dairy farm. We had deer back in the 1960s. There weren't very many, and I was really fascinated by them. I guess fascinated enough to pretty much spend my whole life studying, hunting, consuming deer, things like that. Part of that brought me down to Texas, and I was here for 11 years, all of them at headquarters. The people out in the field would go, "Oh my God, he never got to see Texas, did he?" And so I was administered several programs during that time frame. Texas Big Game Awards program, little thing called Triple T. I think some of you may have heard of that. Deer management permits were just coming up on board. I also had urban and suburban deer, so not all deer are held as sacred things in the state of Texas. A little place called like Hollywood Park, some folks see them as a little bit different. So when I came here, Andy Sansom was executive director, and a couple of years after I'd been here, there was I think it was a seasonal came on, named Carter Smith, and you know, we always kind of wondered how that was going to turn out. I guess we'll still see, right? The jury is still out. So anyway, about 15 years ago, after CWD was detected in the state of Wisconsin, my home state, I had a really unique opportunity to go back and join the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison and work, hand in hand with the state of Wisconsin and virtually every other state, federal agency, and international researchers on CWD. And so it's been a great opportunity for me personally and professionally to spend that time. Just a tiny background on the National Wildlife Health Center. We are a science center within U.S. Geological Survey, and that's a bureau within the Department of the Interior. Our main campus is in Madison, Wisconsin. We also have a field office in Honolulu, Hawaii. I have been trying to get demoted to that field location for pretty much the last 15 years and have failed miserably. So we conduct diagnostics, research, and provide epidemiological and technical assistance out to state, federal, tribal, and international partners. We are the only federal facility dedicated to wildlife health for the purposes of wildlife. There's other folks out there looking at wildlife health, but their interest and their background is a little bit different. USDA has a great wildlife health presence, but you look at the very crux of it, and it's wildlife impacts, the potential impacts on livestock, on agriculture. So our focus is a little bit different. Over the course of, we started out in 1975, and we have been instrumental in researching wildlife diseases, a number of different, very, very significant, issues out there on the landscape, both nationally and internationally. And you notice one of them is this thing we call chronic wasting disease. And we've been involved with CWD since 2002. I think it was the same day that Wisconsin got their results back on their CWD positives early in 2002 that a call was made out to the National Wildlife Health Center. So we've been around for a little while. So enough about me, enough about the background. I guess we should talk about CWD for a little bit. And Nathan, you told me to leave this on, but it goes to sleep. It's all right. So A little summary, CWD in Texas. So you've got your management zones up here in the Panhandle, you've got out in the Trans-Pecos, and you've got a management zone down here in the southern part of the hill country. And the distinction between the yellow and the pink I'll leave to other Texas speakers. So you've got 8 positives to date up in Dallam and Hartley counties. You've got 16 positives, or this was data as of about a week ago out in El Paso and Hudspeth counties. You have a facility, a captive facility over here in Lavaca County where there were a total of 5 positives detected. And I believe those or the traces were back to another facility out here in the southern hill country. And then down in this area, primarily in Medina and spilling over a little bit into Uvalde counties, you've got a total of 103 positives, the majority of them coming from 4 different captive facilities, and 14 animals in associated release sites where animals have been liberated from some of these captive facilities. And at this point in time, a single true free-ranging white-tailed deer just to the east of these release sites has been detected positive. Is that right, Mitch? Pretty close? He's not throwing stuff at me yet, so anyway. So you've got some experience with CWD, but it puts this in perspective. I'd say all in the state of Texas, you're fairly early in the disease cycle, okay? You've done some pretty good work on trying to detect CWD. You've found it in a few places, and you've got some management programs in place. Where you go from here, well, I think that's part of why we're here over the next couple days. I'm going to compare and contrast that with the state of Wisconsin quite briefly. And we're in a slightly different state in the state of Wisconsin with regard to what's going on with CWD. I lean heavily on data from the state of Wisconsin, and that's a tribute to the state of Wisconsin, who has been rigorously collecting CWD surveillance data since their outbreak. So, number one, it's very useful to demonstrate how disease has changed over time. But number two, it's a tribute to the state of Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for collecting over 210,000 CWD samples over the course of 16, 17 years. So, the story begins with 3 CWD positive deer detected in 2001. DNR came out in 2002, collected 40,000 samples statewide to try and get an idea of where CWD is. Big numbers by now. Over 4,100 positives detected, including 600 last year, 25 counties. Largest data set I'm aware of its kind that allows a tremendous amount of research to be done. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to fast forward this and let her roll through the first 17 years of CWD in Wisconsin to give you an idea of how the geographic footprint has changed. Changed a little bit. Changed just a little bit. So that's the picture of CWD distribution in the state of Wisconsin right now as we understand it in free-ranging animals. I would argue there's pretty compelling evidence of geographic spread of CWD in the state of Wisconsin. But I still regularly hear that there's no evidence of spread. I think we've seen evidence of spread just in that slide deck. But in addition to that, a research group at the National Wildlife Health Center worked with some others and created a model and published a model, and it's based on diffusive movement of deer, so deer to deer to deer to deer transmission. And it's kind of interesting the way they went about it. What they did was they took the first 10 years of CWD sampling data collected by Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to create and parameterize the model. Then they used that model to project out the next 3 years of how disease would look based on the first 10. And guess what? It fit what the observed data were very, very closely. So not only, I would argue, is there compelling visual evidence of geographic spread of CWD in the state of Wisconsin, we also have published peer-reviewed research which corroborates that observation. So now I'm going to round out kind of what we, just that kind of little footprint of CWD in the state. So here, you see down in the southern part of the state where most of our free-ranging or CWD positive animals are, I've added captive facilities, CWD captive facilities to the mix. And there have been 102 CWD positive captive facilities to date in the lower 48. We've got 25 of them in Wisconsin. So 1 out of 4 CWD positive captive facilities in the lower 48 are in the state of Wisconsin. Now, the other thing you'll note here is that of these CWD positive facilities, the yellow ones are ones that were depopulated. The red ones are ones that were not depopulated. And so in one of these facilities, there's been a total of 84 positives detected in one of these facilities. And you might note that some of those facilities are in areas of the state that we don't have evidence of CWD and free-ranging deer on the other side of the fence. I would argue from an epidemiological perspective, that is cause for concern. So, you go back early on. I remember this vividly because I was in Texas, and Wisconsin started out with a quite aggressive CWD management protocol. And a few years later, you'd hear state after state when they first detected CWD, man, we are not going to do it like Wisconsin. We are not going to scorch the earth like the state of Wisconsin attempted to do. You know what I hear more recently, though? I sure hope we don't end up like Wisconsin. Quite a story. So, but even as compelling as I think the data, just the visual data from Wisconsin is, I regularly hear some things that present alternative viewpoints about what's out there. Things like CWD is not fatal. It's not even a disease. I hear that pretty regularly. It's not spreading. It's not growing. Change in prevalence is not occurring. It's not having any impact. It's no big deal. Now, why are we even talking about CWD? Why are we doing anything about CWD? Or trying to do anything about CWD? And if you read the newspapers, you'll see things like this pretty regularly. They come to my attention pretty regularly. So I'm completely open. I'm accepting that everyone has an opinion. They have a right to an opinion, and I accept those opinions. But some of these items are a little hard to support from a data standpoint. So I want to try and break some of these arguments down as to whether these are based objective, things that we can look at, whether we can measure, versus some subjective items. So let's take those. So I think these are rather objective issues. The first one, for example, CWD is not fatal. Well, CWD is a member of the family of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. The hallmark of these diseases is progressive neurological degeneration followed by death. When you reach the clinical phase of a TSE, it's a death sentence. Now, for a deer, if you have CWD, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get shot before you die of CWD. But I can tell you one thing that we do understand, that as you're suffering this progressive neurological degeneration, it may predispose you to other forms of death. Things like predation, we saw in the state of Wyoming, getting hit by a car, maybe getting hit by an arrow or by a bullet as well. So CWD, I think of in your garden variety genotype deer, basically as a 2-year death sentence. You're going to die, and likely you're going to die earlier than you would if you were not CWD positive. So the next 3 bullets up there, I'll show you some information that I think will help. Next one, it's not even a disease. Well, I hear that once in a while, that it's challenged that CWD is not even a disease. Maybe it's just a syndrome instead. Sure, there's technical differences between a disease and a syndrome, but I think it's rather nuanced. And when we think about CWD as concerns from a management perspective, it's really largely irrelevant. And I would also argue that when you're looking at a deer like that, whether it's dying of chronic wasting disease or chronic wasting syndrome, is largely irrelevant. The final 2 on here, those are pretty subjective issues, right? Those are opinions. And like I said, everyone is entitled to their opinion, but I hope that those opinions are really informed by data and science. And so that's what we're kind of here, I think, for the course of the next couple of days, is to help elucidate experiences in other states, science that's been conducted and will be conducted, is being conducted, that'll help you form your opinions of whether CWD is serious, and if it is, what you want to do about it, right? Kind of why we're here, or at least I hope, Carter. All right. Said I can't really help you with those last two, the subjective issues, but let's try and go through some of that more objective science, right? What's objective about that, right? So I was going through a couple boxes recently, and I was told that if you have boxes that you haven't opened in 15 years, it's likely that you really don't need most of the things that are in there. But I found this inside there. Some of you may have heard of this guy. And Bob Cook is a tremendous friend of mine and a mentor. And boy, I think it was a tremendous honor to be able to work for Bob over the course of a long period of time. And you fold that over, and it got me thinking. That mission statement, and I don't know if the mission statement for Parks and Wildlife is the same today. Typically, new executive directors come in, and the first thing they want to muck with is the mission statement. So there might be a couple words changed in there. I don't know. What's on the back of your business card? Pretty close. Okay. So anyway, it's that last phrase that gets me. For the enjoyment of current and future generations. And I think that rings true with CWD. Yeah, we've known about CWD for 50 years now. And only quite recently, the last 10 years, that some of the real true characteristics of CWD have become very, very obvious. And so I would suggest, if nothing else, it's really important to take the long view of this disease. Just because many populations with CWD don't show a lot of outward signs of population level impacts today, we may be getting there. We may be getting there. So I think it would be imprudent to write off CWD as no big deal. But again, that's your decision. So back to those subjective questions one more time. A couple of years ago, Mike Miller from the state of Colorado, John Fisher from SCWD, Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study, put together a presentation about the first 5 generations, 50 years of CWD. They presented at the North American Wildlife Conference in 2016. And they boiled down that big picture question of why should we care about CWD into 2, I think, kind of interesting points. And I've got them here on this slide. And first, in the long term, CWD has shown it can be pretty hard on deer populations. Reason number 1, I think that's a pretty good reason why we might be concerned about CWD. Second one is that even though today there is absolutely no evidence that CWD has crossed the species barrier and become a human health issue, it's hard to rule it out because other TSEs, one especially, has shown a propensity, and we do have TSEs of humans, so can't rule it out. But from a big picture, those are some pretty compelling reasons why we might consider CWD to be an important disease. So let's take a look. With respect to deer, here's 3 characteristics I think we could use to take a look at CWD or virtually any other disease that might help inform our opinion about whether it's serious. Is it spreading? Is it growing in prevalence? And is it impacting populations? So those would be 3 pretty important parameters, whether you're looking at a disease in livestock, a disease in humans, disease in wildlife. Do we agree from Texas Animal Health Commission? Pretty close anyway. Okay. So let's take a look at these. First, I want to hit geographic spread. And we talked a little bit about the state of Wisconsin, but here I'm going to show you, a set of slides about geographic distribution in North America. So while the data I had from Wisconsin was from the state of Wisconsin, this I've received data from virtually every state, from USDA and from Canadian Food Inspection Agency and a number of state agricultural entities as well. So let's roll through. Before 2000, CWD was little known. As far as we knew, it was restricted to this very small geographic region in Wyoming and Colorado, and it had been picked up in just a handful of captive commercial facilities, both in the United States and in Canada. By the way, you may remember in 2003 when we had our first BSE positive cow came from Canada. That was a thank you gift for sending a CWD to their captive industry from the state of South Dakota. So it was just a little bit of payback. So I've been told anyway. So again, I'm just going to roll through the next few years. And each year kind of is highlighted as that known documented geographic footprint develops through time. So that's the known footprint through about a month ago. This is current as of yesterday. I had to add 3 counties along the northern tier of Montana where CWD was just detected. I think over the course, it was announced, I think, day before yesterday, so I just added that in. So it changes pretty regularly. So in the United States, we have detected documented CWD in 25 states in captive and or free-ranging populations. At the most recent count, I think we're at 102 captive commercial facilities where CWD has been detected. Now, I also will recognize that a portion of what you see up here is discovery. For instance, we've got CWD in Arkansas. When they picked it up a couple years ago, it was at relatively high prevalence. So they had missed disease for some period of time. So I think you're seeing the combination of 2 phenomena in this map. One is discovery, and one is spread, geographic spread. But it would be very, very challenging to rule out that CWD is spreading. And certainly, the known documented geographic footprint of CWD is substantially larger than it was just a few years ago. So that's geographic spread. What about prevalence, or this change in the proportion of animals positive for CWD over time? So we've got peer-reviewed documentation and observations data from a number of different states showing that the proportion of animals in different sex and age cohorts has changed over time. So again, I'll come back to Wisconsin because I've got access to this great data set. So here are 3 zones in the CWD positive region of the state. And each one of those represents 4 townships. So that's 12 miles by 12 miles, each one of them. And on the DNR's website, you can find these charts which show changes in prevalence in various cohorts over time. The dark blue one is adult males. The solid yellow one is adult females. And the dashed lines represent yearling animals, those animals that are 18 months of age. And so the blue dashed line is yearling males, yellow dashed is yearling females. So those are statistically smoothed curves based on the data. So a month or so ago, I wanted to pull some of the raw data. And so what you're seeing here is no statistical smoothing, no statistical formulas. These are raw data collected from a 16 township region. So this is 24 by 24 miles, and what's 24 squared? Come on, Carter. It's 576 square miles. That was the math test for today. I promise that'll be the only one. So it's not a really, really small geographic area. 24 miles on a side is probably similar to some of the Texas counties, things like that. So it's not the size of a postage stamp. And so, again, raw data, what you're seeing here is 2 trends. Number one, that as you increase age from yearling to 2.5 to 3.5 to 4.5 and 5.5-year-old animals, you're seeing increased prevalence with age. The other phenomena you will see here is that over time, I've broken this up into 5 different time frames. So take a look at the 4.5 and 5.5-year-old deer from this area. Back in 2002 to 2005, it was hard to find CWD. Look at the prevalence in 4.5 and 5.5-year-old deer from the last 3 years. So if you're fortunate enough to kill a 4.5-year-old deer just south of where Doug Duran lives, and he's going to speak to you tomorrow, literally you can take a coin out of your pocket, flip it in the air, and those are the odds that that deer has CWD. So pretty significant disease penetrance. Now, what I think is alarming from an epidemiological standpoint is what's going on with yearlings. Couldn't find yearlings positive. And now, in that zone, 1 out of 5 18-month-old males has CWD. So it's pretty interesting change over time. Now, I can show you the female data. It's pretty similar curves, So now what about this documented population impact? So it's spreading, it's growing, or I would argue the data supports that it's spreading and it's growing. What about these population level impacts? So we clearly have peer-reviewed scientific documentation of impacts in these 3 species. We have the author of one of those papers, Dave Edmonds, is right here, and I think he's going to talk about that at some point over the course of the next 2 days. So we've got peer-reviewed science supporting population impacts. Well, what do I mean by population impacts? You note I did not use the term population decline, although in some isolated herds where CWD has been their longest, we have evidence of population decline. But let's talk about population impacts first, shall we? So over on the left here, we have what is called lambda, okay? And it's a single numeric indicator of population performance. So if lambda is at 1.0, you have a numerically stationary population. Sure, there's annual fluctuations, but over time, that population is fairly level. So let's say you have a lambda of 1.5. That's indicative of a pretty rapid population growth. 50% per year population growth with a lambda of 1.5. Now, that distance between lambda of whatever your herd is at and 1 is what we shoot every year and what we hit with our cars every year and all other sources of mortality, right? So that's your harvestable surplus. So in general, I would think we'd want to keep lambda above 1. If you have lambda down in this area, that's indicative of population decline, okay? So a paper that was published back in 2014 dealing with elk in Rocky Mountain National Park found that CWD was holding lambda in that population at about 1.0. So that population was numerically stable, stationary with CWD, which means that in essence, that population couldn't sustain any other external force to it without losing. Dave Edmonds published his doctoral research on white-tailed deer in a portion of east central Wyoming, and in that herd he documented a lambda of 0.9 and concluded that CWD was having an impact and causing population decline in that system. Similar system, Malia DeVivo finished up and published her doctoral work a few years later and found a lambda of 0.79, representing a 21% population decline per year. So here's the abstract of the paper that Dr. DeVivo published. Dave was a co-author, and just for clarity, I was a co-author on this publication as well. So one of the things we found in this population is if you were healthy, if you were a CWD negative deer, you had a 76% chance of being alive 1 year from today. If you were CWD positive in this herd, your odds of survival were reduced to 32%. So if you're alive today and you have CWD, you only have a 1 in 3 chance of being alive 1 year from today. So pretty demonstrable change in life expectancy due to your disease status. So now I've regularly heard, well, that's out west. Mule deer populations, elk populations that aren't very productive. What about an eastern white-tailed deer population in deer food Mecca? Would it be any different? And the verdict is, we don't know at this point in time. But Dr. Dan Storm started a research study in the state of Wisconsin And it's kind of interesting. After the first year of results came back in, he found that if you are CWD negative, you had about a 75% chance of being alive a year from now. Identical, virtually identical to what we saw in the Wyoming system. And he also observed that if you have CWD, you have a 1 in 4 chance of being alive a year from today. So again, we don't really know what CWD is doing at the population level in this heavily infected area of Wisconsin, but there's a research study being sponsored by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Tammy Ryan is here, representing the DNR, and Dan Storm, and I think they'll be talking about that research study. So it'll take a while, but it would be hard to believe that CWD at the levels we have in Wisconsin right now is not causing some sort of a population impact. Note, I did not say population decline, but when you've got prevalence in adult females up over 30%, it's going to be pretty challenging to figure out how that disease is not impacting at the population level. So that's kind of the summary with respect to what CWD might be doing with regard to deer. Well, what about humans? All right, so I am not a medical doctor. And so I'm not going to make recommendations about what people should do with regard to health risk. But I'll boil it down into a couple of, I think, salient topics that the literature would support. And first, as I mentioned earlier, there is no indication, no clear case where CWD has crossed over the species barrier into a human host. But based on a pretty large number of research studies, we can't rule it out. Plus, there's also some recent peer-reviewed science that suggests that species barrier, maybe a molecular barrier that keeps CWD from crossing over and causing disease in humans, that barrier may not be as robust as we once thought it was, and it may be changing over time. So that's all I'm going to say about the chances of CWD in human health, other than, again, clarify, I'm not a human health expert, but some other folks are. So what do they say? Here's the World Health Organization. They state very clearly, after their experience with BSE or mad cow disease, that no part or product of any animal which has shown signs of ATSE, including CWD, should enter the human or animal food chain. Pretty straightforward advice. Well, how about our Centers for Disease Control in the United States? And you can get this directly from their website online, and they identify that hunters, if you are hunting in an area with CWD, you strongly consider having that deer or elk tested for CWD. And if it tests positive, they do not mince words with regard to their recommendation. They don't mince words at all. And it's out of an abundance of caution, but they do not mince words. If it has CWD, don't eat it. So those are kind of the first two reasons that I brought up about why we might be concerned about CWD. It's a problem for deer in the long term, and we can't rule out that human health issue. There's another one that's based on human dimensions research. And these studies have been repeated a couple times, and we refer to that highly technical term, the ick factor. And based on human dimensions research, if and when prevalence gets up in that 30, 40, 50% range in the place that you hunt, either you or a family member of yours might just change your behavior. Okay? You might not want to go hunting there anymore when prevalence gets high for a whole host of reasons. So that would be a challenge for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Many of the state agencies that I work with, hunting, especially big game hunting, that's the bread and butter. It's the main funding mechanism for those agencies. And if our hunting behavior changes in response to a disease on the landscape, it might be challenging to do some of the things you do, not only for deer and deer habitat, but all the other activities that Texas Parks and Wildlife is responsible for. So another one to put on there. On the bottom, I added one on here, and it's these things that we never really suspected might happen. So it's kind of an open book. But I'm going to take a look at just one of them. So we know through peer-reviewed publications that some plants, when you grow them in a slurry of disease-associated prion protein, that some plants can uptake disease-associated prion protein through their roots and deposit them in aerial tissues, stems, and leaves. We also know that prions, when they're shed by, deer or elk through urine or feces, can form a chemical bond to plants. And we know that these plants that are contaminated with prions can transmit disease in laboratory models. We don't know what goes on in the real world. But these could contribute to disease dynamics. So now I'm going to take you through another little scenario. What about agricultural commodities? So we know that there are deer out there in places like this. We know through the literature that deer do this between 15 and 30 times a day, depending on which paper you read. So we know that deer leave some of those out in that same agricultural field. Is there a possibility that that mechanically some of this material could be incorporated into agricultural commodities that we then pick up off the ground, take to other places? And in some instances, is it possible that those contaminated agricultural commodities could end up out in the pasture where healthy, susceptible, naive animals would encounter them? So right now, I can see folks in the back thinking, Richards went off the deep end again. He's just trying to scare us. And Carter's thinking, what time did he say his plane was? So CWD was detected in Norway a couple of years ago. And one of the responses by the European Food Safety Authority was to conduct a risk assessment. After all, this was the first time CWD had been detected in Europe, and they wanted to provide guidance, advice on maybe how they could keep it from spreading further. And you'll notice that the EFSA recommended that agricultural commodities grown in Norway not go to the rest of Europe out of an abundance of caution. Well, the Norwegian Food Safety Authority took that a step further, and they changed their regulations this year, and you can blame Google Translate for that word there. I believe it should say hay and straw as opposed to high and straw. So Norway has implemented a ban. You can no longer import hay and straw from the United States or Canada unless you have a veterinarian certificate going along with it that certifies CWD has not been detected in the state or province where that stuff came from. Now, I doubt that the hay and straw market between North America and Norway is very strong at this point in time, but I would also suggest that it's not that far-fetched to think that other countries may consider similar actions and that may expand beyond hay and straw. It's not out of the realm of possibility. So unintended, just total things we never thought about, how CWD could have impacts to things that are important to us. So that kind of rolls through that whole situation of things we might consider when we're trying to figure out whether CWD is important or not. I'm going to take one step. I'm going to use a crystal ball, and my crystal ball is usually quite faulty. So where are we going in the future? So based on where we've been, I think it's not unreasonable to say that CWD will continue to spread. It'll continue to grow in prevalence in local populations, in localized areas where we've seen them already. I think it's not beyond belief to think that we'll continue to see these impacts, beginning with harvestable surplus being diminished in areas with long-term CWD, population declines in some herds, and a completely open question as to whether these very localized impacts we've observed 50 years in will become more regional phenomena. I don't have a crystal ball that predicts that one. Another one, demographic impacts will be observed. And we saw that area, outside where Doug lives, where we've got, 50% prevalence in 4.5 and 5.5-year-old deer. We've got 20% prevalence in yearlings. Half of them are dead in a year. We've got 30% prevalence in 2.5-year-olds. Half of them are dead in a year. We're almost at 40% prevalence by the time 3.5 years old. Half of them are dead in a year. So the quiz question is, if you're trying to produce older aged animals, 5, 6, 7-year-old animals in a heavily infected CWD positive population, how many of those animals are you going to have? Oops, I told you only one math question. The answer is probably not a lot. Okay, and this has been observed in at least one population that I'm aware of out in Wyoming, and there's at least some evidence not too far from where Doug lives, that places that they regularly used to see, these big, mature white-tailed deer, they just don't. They just don't see them. So hunters will alter their behavior. I get numerous calls each year from people that say, you know what, I just can't. I can't justify doing this anymore. So if we were to come to the conclusion that, CWD is important, the next logical question, I guess, is, well, what do you want to do about it? So I'm not here to tell you what to do about it. That's not my role in life. That's yours, right? But I do think we can boil this down into two relatively straightforward categories of activities. First, we can identify ways that humans, people, might move infectious agent around, and then we can implement measures to try and stop that. Preventative measures, right? You mentioned it, Carter. We've got it in a few places. We certainly don't want it to go any farther. So what are those things? Things we might consider is moving live deer, moving dead deer, moving parts of dead deer. How about moving and using other things that might be contaminated by infectious agent? Bulldozers, trucks, boots. If you are in a mode of trying to identify risk and deal with risk, keep open. What are the possibilities? Think deep and long and hard about what are the possibilities about how humans might move infectious agent around. And if you're concerned about it, try and deal with it. The second is likely a little bit more challenging. I call that first group up there low-hanging fruit. Now, people in this room might argue that those low-hanging fruit are pretty challenging to pick sometimes, but really from a disease perspective, those are the low-hanging fruit. The ones on the bottom here, trying to deal with disease where it occurs in places like Wyoming, Colorado, Wisconsin, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. So I'll note that, to date, our management efforts in free-ranging populations have been largely ineffective. Now, I will open up the possibility that maybe it's not the management technique that went wrong, it was our implementation. And we've got numerous instances where states, provinces have tried to be aggressive, implement an aggressive response to CWD, and due to social and political pressure, they've been forced to curtail those efforts. Now, I took this directly from a Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies management report on how to deal with CWD, or approaches how we might want to deal with CWD in the Western states. And I'm hoping that Dr. Mary Wood from the state of Wyoming will incorporate a little bit of this. But I think this is really a strong statement. Opportunities exist for responsible management agencies to alter the course of disease. Are we going to eliminate CWD from the landscape in places like Wyoming, Colorado, and Wisconsin? Pretty remote possibility that we're going to do that. But are there things that we can do to alter the outcomes, change the course of disease? And I believe absolutely that there are. There are things that we can do. But as we've seen time and time again, maybe the most important thing is stakeholder support, because if we lose the people, we've lost that battle. So convincing stakeholders that you're on the right track may be one of the most important things we can do. And again, I break that down into two very, very, very simple things, but implementing these is anything but simple. And that's why we're here today and tomorrow. And I'm not going to get too much into management at all, because the true experts are the people that are in this room, the other folks that you invited here today and tomorrow to share their experiences in their states and their research, to help you folks, you people who manage deer in the state of Texas, to help develop next steps. I am going to go through a couple case studies, though, just to elucidate a few different outcomes. Let's first take a look at state of New York. CWD was picked up in 2 captive facilities in 2005. I think they were like 10 miles apart or something like that. And there was direct trace, of activity between those 2 facilities. The state immediately implemented some pretty rigorous outbreak surveillance. They wanted to go out and look to see whether CWD had escaped confines, whether it was out there on the landscape. They found 2 positives, and they're the kind of that fuchsia circles up there. And these were about a half a mile apart. They found both of those positives in their first round of outbreak surveillance of a couple hundred animals. Okay? Since that point in time, they have collected thousands and thousands and thousands of samples in that area and never found another CWD positive out in free-ranging herds. So they picked it up, they went out and looked for it, they dealt with CWD, the 2 farms were depopulated, CWD somehow got out on the landscape, but it's pretty clear that CWD did not become established in that free-ranging herd. No evidence that it got established. So I don't think there's a better outcome possible. Finding it early, dealing with it early, and man, they're breathing a sigh of relief. I get calls from New York once in a while, and they want me to take New York off my state of CWD positive states. I think they have a compelling argument. They have a compelling argument. I still say no. A little bit about Wisconsin, I've already highlighted a lot, and Tammy Ryan's going to tell you a lot more about it, Wisconsin. But so again, how many times, raise your hand, how many times have you heard that Wisconsin completely failed in their CWD management attempts? Yeah, we've heard that once or twice anyway. And also, I've seen that parlayed into something bigger, that's proof that we shouldn't do anything with CWD. It's impossible to manage CWD in the wild. So I wanted to take you a little history of management, okay? So in response to CWD, Wisconsin on the hunter side did 2 things. Number 1, they started having really long deer seasons. And number 2, they implemented this tool called Earn-a-Buck. Okay? And this was the most draconian tool ever invented since the inception of knives and things like that. So in order to earn the opportunity to shoot a buck, you had to kill a doe first. And this was insidious, and it was horrible. So anyway, we had relatively long seasons, except in Texas, I think your deer season is probably longer than the long seasons. But there was a public reaction. And actually in 2006, the DNR was pretty much compelled to eliminate Earn-a-Buck and cut deer season length down to a more traditional value, right? So were there any effects? So in this slide, we've got postseason, 5 o'clock, the last day of deer season, population estimates from the original core area of the state of Wisconsin. And we see that with long seasons and Earn-a-Buck, we were seeing a population decline. The whole theory at that point in time was that by taking the deer population down dramatically could interrupt transmission dynamics of disease and alter the outcome of disease. Now we also see quite clearly what happened when we eliminated Earn-a-Buck and went back to that more traditional season. The deer population responded immediately. So when I see in the paper, hey, there's all kinds of deer in Wisconsin, so yeah, anyway. So was it the tool? Was it the implementation? Did the Wisconsin DNR fail? Or did we, the stakeholders, have a big portion of that responsibility in where CWD is in the state of Wisconsin today? That's kind of an open question. How about Alberta? How am I doing on time? 10 minutes? Pretty close there. Okay, so this is Alberta, Saskatchewan. I apologize to the people on this side of the room. I should have done this once in a while, but it's easier for me to see up there. So CWD started developing in Saskatchewan. Alberta really decided early on they wanted no part of it. So this data is actually from 2007. The first case was detected in free-ranging animals in Alberta in 2005. They didn't really want any part of it, so they decided to implement some fairly aggressive measures. And so in kind of these zones, they implemented fairly aggressive agency culling. Ooh, there's another one of those evil words, agency culling, trying to keep CWD at bay and maybe just eliminate it, push it back in. In 2007 and 2008, they really went further, and they implemented hunting from an aerial platform, shall we say, or culling from an aerial platform. We would call it as a helicopter. And you know what? They were incredibly effective. They found that you could take about 200 deer a day from that elevated platform. Incredibly effective. But, you know, if you ever wanted to find something that was less popular than earn a buck, it might be government culling from a helicopter. It might just be. And so Alberta had to report that same thing I think we saw in Wisconsin and maybe elsewhere, that the program failed in the crucial area of maintaining support and was not delivered in 2009. So the carpet was ripped underneath, out from underneath this program. Well, how did CWD respond? It's doing quite nicely in Alberta, thank you. Geographic spread and what very much appears to be an exponential increase in CWD prevalence. So again, very, very similar to Wisconsin. So one more example. How about Norway? CWD was detected a couple of years ago, 2016, in reindeer in caribou in Norway. And they also picked up a small number of cases in moose and red deer. They have no idea how it got there, but they looked at us in North America and I said, you know, we don't want to be like you. We do not want CWD to get established. And so really they took the gloves off. They did the things that we have talked about in North America but have been unable to deliver to date. They decided to eliminate every reindeer in this herd unit. And that herd unit is about 50 miles by 50 miles, so not a postage stamp size area, but not a huge area. They were very public about it. They announced their plans in Science magazine, of all places, about how they were going to respond to CWD. So you can't be more public than that. So the idea was take the herd unit out and keep it fallow for a long period of time, a minimum of 5 years. And so they took it seriously. They allowed hunters the first swing at it, and hunters took about 1,000 reindeer out of this herd unit, and government came in and took a little over 1,400 out last winter. So they eliminated every reindeer in this herd unit. They came up with a total of I think it was 22 or 23 positives. Tracy could probably check my number on there. She's saying, don't ask me that. Anyway, it was around 1% prevalence. So very low, suggesting that they caught this very, very early in the outbreak, and hopefully early enough that there was not significant environmental contamination that could lead to future infection in that herd. So they caught it early, they took the gloves off, and I would argue that this has a pretty strong likelihood of success. And this is if you could pull it off. So when people tell me it's impossible, there's nothing we can do about CWD, I say, well, Norway didn't take that attitude. Norway did not take that attitude. So what do I got now? 5 minutes? So there's a couple of items that the sponsors asked me to cover. And I'm not going to be able to do justice to them in 5 minutes. But the other folks in this room, I think some of the other speakers will cover them. So one of the things we've heard is this need for a live test for CWD. Well, we've had one. We've been doing live antemortem testing on animals for a very long period of time. We use the same assays. We use tonsil tissues or rectal anal mucosa tissues, and even in Texas now I understand that you're doing assays, collecting tissue samples from retropharyngeal lymph nodes and testing them. So I would argue the utility for these assays is higher for the captive industry than it is on the free-ranging side. I would also argue that there are clear limitations with regard to what antemortem testing can do. There are no current assays that can detect CWD very early in disease. It takes a while for disease-associated prion protein to be deposited in various tissues, and so our assays cannot pick up CWD until it's there to pick up. Now, I'm not saying we don't need better assays. Boy, I'm all in favor of improved assays, but I would argue that maybe, at least on the wildlife side, that being able to pick up evidence of prion contamination in environmental mediums would be very, very important to us. So I regularly hear we need a live test, and I think we need better tests, but I've got a different use for them, or maybe a complementary use for those assays. And I think we'll hear about some of the sensitivity of assays maybe later on today. I look forward to that. Another one that, tell you what, with the amount of time we've got left, we're not going to be able to get there. Spontaneous or sporadic CWD. There is evidence now from, I've talked about those 3 moose and a red deer over in Norway. There's at least some evidence that these behave very similarly to things like classic Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, atypical BSE, NOR98 strain of scrapie, which there's a ton of evidence there suggesting that these diseases may just happen. But there's specific criteria that these diseases follow, these spontaneous versions of disease. Clinical profile, older-aged animals. The moose were 13 and 14 years old. We rarely see that type of animal on this side of the pond. No evidence of lymphatic system involvement. So these animals are likely not shedding, they're dead-end hosts. We see differences in the lesion profile between these suggested sporadic versions of disease and the more traditional versions. And there's a lot of research out there, peer-reviewed, suggesting that these differences are very real. So I'll leave it here that we have no evidence at this point in time that there is any spontaneous version of CWD in the United States. Does that rule out that there couldn't be? No, it doesn't, but we have no evidence that there is. Thank you, sir. All right, genetic resistance. Who's going to talk about genetics? Somebody. Okay, we got that covered, so I don't have to do that. Vaccines. That's the last one I'm going to hit on. I think Dr. Wood will talk a little bit about vaccine research. And there was a trial that was done in Wyoming. It didn't work out so well. But you know what? As far as the long term, if there is a tool that I believe holds promise for dealing with CWD, it's vaccines. If we're going to turn this thing around, if we're going to change this thing, I think it will be vaccines that have a lot to do with it. So let's close this up. To kind of end up where we started. I want to thank everybody, for putting up with me for close to an hour. What time's my plane? All right. Deer are pretty darn important here. How many billions of economic input from deer hunters every year? A couple billion. How many millions of hunter days and strong heritage of deer and deer hunting? A bunch. Yeah, you guys, it's unbelievable the opportunities you have. No place else can you pick up wild deer from one place and move them to another place. If you don't like the deer on your ranch, you can shoot them out and you can get a whole new set of deer. You can take scientific breeder deer and move a buck out so he can breed wild does and then put the buck back in captivities and use his genetics out there in the pasture. You've got tremendously long deer seasons. You've got so many opportunities with deer and deer management in the state of Texas. It's unbelievable. And many of these things are nightmares from an epidemiologist standpoint. Moving, commingling, all these things. So you have tremendous opportunities, but along with those opportunities come risks. You've done a pretty good job. Back in 2003, you kind of closed the border based on CWD being detected in other states. So live cervids can't come into the state. You've got carcass import restrictions, dealing with the risk that a hunter that goes to Colorado or Wisconsin might bring a whole carcass home and dump the spinal column out on the back 40. You've got restrictions in place. So you've done pretty well there. You've got management protocols that you've implemented immediately upon detection of CWD. So you're doing some of the very smart, the very common sense things that realistically follow the prescription for CWD management. What should you do next? Again, that's not up to me. It's not up to any of the speakers. It's up to the folks in this room. You're the deer managers, in the state of Texas on many different levels. I'd suggest that CWD, like we started out, like the back of Bob Cook's, business card. Take the long view. Take the long view. Think not just what you want to see on opening day next year, but think what you want your grandchildren to see on opening day 50 years from now. I'd argue that's a pretty important concept, and I'd urge you to keep that going. Billions of dollars, millions of everything. So much at stake with deer in the state of Texas that I think ignoring this disease, doing nothing, is clearly not an option. So with that, I want to thank you very sincerely for putting up with me for the last hour of your lives. And I'll be available over the course of the next 2 days. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the wonderful experiences in science that all the rest of these experts are going to present us. So thank you very much.